Hi there. So, I want to kind of give a bit of a forward before we get into this. I had to stop hitting my mic. I want to be clear that this is going to be divided into 3 separate videos because I want each of them to be their own chunk and a different series of arguments. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So, we're going to be talking about 3 things. I'm going to be defining the word transgender and explain my understanding and my way of viewing that. I'm then going to discuss non-binary people and why they are transgender, and why I am very against either transmedicalists or some non-binary people sort of questioning that level of inclusion. Okay? And then third, I want to talk about the TERF phrase, and I'm going to give a trigger warning for this, and that's going to be a trigger warning for that video. You will never be a woman, and why this is utterly stupid. Okay? So, let's get into the first one. So, a little bit of context. This is why this excuse me, I keep hiccuping. This is why this conversation keeps happening. Very simple picture, right? Big trans umbrella, binary, non-binary. Now, whether you believe this to be true or not depends utterly on how you define this word. So that's what we're going to start with, because this picture on a particular site caused a lot of discussion to come up of people, I want to be honest, whining that they didn't want to be included under transgender even though they were non-binary. And I'll be honest, I am very suspicious of that line of thinking. Not only as a non-binary woman, but also as somebody who wants utter inclusion in the LGBT, because the more of us there are, the harder it is to shut us the fuck up, right? So, I mean, pretty simple argument there. So let's get into this first one. My definition of trans is as such. A transgender person is someone who, at some point in their life, becomes aware of a sort of gender dissonance, right? So let's play with words for a second. Dissonance. Fuck off. There we go. Lack of agreement, an instance of such inconsistency or disagreement. Right? Sound familiar? So this term actually is not from me. I'm not that smart. This came from the beautiful and wonderful Julia Serrano. I've been listening to her book, The Whipping Girl, which has been pretty fantastic. I highly recommend it, especially for trans femmes and trans women. But in psychology, there is this term cognitive dissonance. That is when you're holding 2 ideas separately. And the anecdote I've heard on this, which I need to verify again because it's been a while, but the anecdote I know about this is that cognitive dissonance is kind of a bitch, because you either have to A, through dialectical thinking, come to some sort of synthesis. That is, you take thesis, antithesis, and synthesize, that is synthesis, into something sort of a combination of those things, or moving past the disagreement, right? Very, very, very basic description of that. So gender dissonance in this argument would be the idea that you are a person that at some point in your life, whether this was something being disowned, whether this is something you didn't have language for, whether this is something you knew at age 3, doesn't fucking matter. What matters is there is a dissonance with your assigned gender. That is, you were born X and you don't believe you're X, or don't feel wholly resonant with X, maybe. Right? Because we want to include, say, demigirls, things like that. So, why am I defining this word? Because I want to be clear that in a lot of cases, gender and the experience of such becomes really, really complicated. I think this is a lot where like the RGR discussion is really fascinating, because I think her descriptions are accurate. I just don't like the way her terminology works because it feels ungainly. But I think she's on the right track. Essentially, if I use my own language and the language that I would co-opt from, say, like someone like Destiny who was talking to her, is that there's sort of this difference between your own gender identity, the internal experience of gender, and gender expression, how you appear. Often, your gender expression may not match your internal sense of who you are, in which case we call that dysphoria, either social dysphoria or physical dysphoria. Still with me? So this idea that there is a dissonance between the assigned gender at birth versus what you believe your gender to be, whether that's male, female, femme, masc, non-binary, and all the flavors therein. All of these things are based on this inherent dissonance. Now, I've heard this also referred to as an intuition, an intuitive understanding. And I think this is really important because that's, I think, very true. If we're going to judge whether someone is trans or not, I really get skeptical of any mapping system or definition that essentially tries to make a gate against people who are absolutely trans. This is why I look at trans medicalists such as Blair White, Buck Angel, Rose of Dawn, Calvin Gara, and so on with a lot of suspicion. Because not only are they actively being dishonest, that is, they are not actually touting current medical understanding of trans people, and they are also spreading hate towards non-binary people. What they're doing is essentially using a definition of being trans that is so utterly reductive that it doesn't even fit some trans women and trans men who are binary transgender. So let's explore that for just 10 seconds. Transmedicalism, which is what these people believe in ostensibly, is the idea that being trans is due to differences in the brain. You have a girl brain in your boy body or whatever. And essentially the issue is that, you know, this is a mental disorder. Don't worry too much about me. This is a mental disorder, right? And the problem with that pathologizing is it creates very limited ways of looking at being trans. You are either a trans man or a trans woman. And this is gross. It's just gross. Now, while those brain studies are useful to understand things such as how this may come about, the idea that using this data creates this idea of pathology that is so incredibly rigid, it essentially cuts out non-binary people, and it also makes every single trans person who fits in that some miserable wretch that's dealing with a mental illness. Now, I want to be very clear. I suffer from mental illness. I have things like depression. The fact is, I'm not saying being mentally ill is in and of itself always the worst thing in the world, or that it is something that is absolutely puts you into this pitiable state. I don't think that's the case. I know a lot of people that live with mental illness. My partner especially lives with PMDD. These things, yeah, the idea that you are a wretch because you have mental illness is fucking nonsense. But that's kind of the framework, isn't it? That's what they're doing. When transmedicalists talk about this, they're essentially using the argument of pity me. I'm just dealing with this. I'm the one good one. My argument for this would be is the reason that they do this is because, one, it better lets them set up their identity and hopefully get accepted, but also it's one of the ways you can deal with dissonance. What I would argue is that because of this intuitive knowing of what being trans is, that is, you know that your gender does not meet your assigned gender, one could argue then that gender dysphoria is a mental illness, and it is based on the repression or the awareness of not being congruent with your gender identity and your gender expression not following suit in the cases of physical or social dysphoria. Does that make sense? I'll say that again. Gender dissonance is the intuitive knowing of a difference between your identity, that is who you are, and your assigned gender at birth and your gender expression. There's a dissonance. There's a disagreement between those two things, right? Gender dysphoria, then, I would argue, is a form of disorder where a person, either due to societal pressures, abuse, or any numbers of fucking things, by definition, comes about because the person is trying to repress, get rid of, or is suddenly becoming aware of just how much they don't match their identity. So we got to be very clear on this. Gender dysphoria does create harm, so I would still define it as pathology. It harms the trans person. And the fact is, even someone, like myself who's fairly decent into transition, I still get it often. There are a lot of times where I will cry in my partner's arms because I don't feel like me. And I know the transphobes out there are going to be like, well, yeah, you're just like a woman. Fuck off. Like, no, it's because you assholes occasionally do find a little niche in my head and get to live there rent-free for 10 seconds. Or my own doubts, which are, by the way, way better at arguing than you fucks. Full off, like, are just coming at me hot and heavy. Ever since I started watching Debate Bros and, like, different leftists online, I'm going to be really clear. My rhetoric against arguing against stupidity has gotten much better, but also my ways of arguing against my own stupidity have gotten much better, which is great when I'm trying to call myself out. Not so great when I'm, like, trying to tear myself down. Not a fan. So, coming back to this, let me get a drink of water. So, I will argue that a transgender person is a person who experiences gender dissonance. And in some cases, this can lead to one particular type of pathology known as gender dysphoria. Now, to be very clear, I am totally cool with anyone arguing that point on dysphoria. I'm open to discussion and debate on that, but that is what I'm working with for here. The reason why this definition is something I feel myself very compelled by is, well, one, it just seems to be the definition. So let's look at the National Center for Transgender Equality. What does it mean to be transgender? Transgender people are people whose gender identity is different from the gender that they thought they would be at birth. Trans is often used as a shorthand for transgender. Right? So what we're talking about in this situation is just that dissonance. All there needs to be for you to be trans is to have that dissonance. The reason I'm putting the goalpost there and I'm burying that fucker 6 feet deep is because I am functionally against any form of exclusion in gender nonconforming people. That is, honestly, I'll respect intersex people's desire to be separate from, but ideally I would actually love, especially if they are trans, let's say they've been assigned a gender at birth and, they've gone through something horrid or some other problem, or there's at least debate on that. Like, I still put them under as like sort of like trans cousins. Like I will absolutely be respectful and actually love these people. I've got actually a number of people I interact with online that are intersex, and it's fucking great. You people are wonderful. But I include them under the trans umbrella because I honestly think it's a thing of either all boats raise together or nobody gets out of here. Like, we, by definition, have to include as many people as possible to be as effective politically as possible. So I want everyone in the pool. Okay? So why this matters when we're talking about being trans. So we can look at Live Science's article on this. They talk about it. Transgender is an umbrella term that describes people whose gender identity or expression does not match the sex that they were assigned at birth. For example, a trans person may identify as a woman despite having been born with male genitalia. They actually reference the National Center for Transgender Equality. And they even get data showing about 1.4 million adults in the United States identify as such. Cool. So, again, this is one of the things I think is important. If you do not resonate or you experience dissonance with your assigned gender at birth, you're trans. Full stop. You're just fucking trans. You just are. And so this is the definition. And I want to kind of paint this, and the reason I'm separating these videos out is because I want to paint them in separate ways. This first one is just to outline very clearly why the fuck people get stuck on this. Because I think it's actually pretty dumb. Right? I honestly think this is just right-wing talking points getting into people's heads. The fact is that if someone says they're a woman, they're a woman. And now we can make arguments from like performative theory as to whether or not they're actually behaving as a woman. What does a woman mean? But again, I feel like this is all mental masturbation. We all have at least some idea in our head of what a woman is or what things are genuinely associated with women. And there's going to be some Venn diagram overlap, but there's going to be some that isn't. And essentially, the idea being is that any system that doesn't have the level of inclusion mine does, I get very skeptical of, because what it does is it essentially says that the person's self-ID isn't sufficient enough. This is actually a thing I would take up with Riley Grace Rochong, is that she's often looking for a very cogent argument of gender, and I understand why that is, because she works in law. But I don't. I work in therapy. My shit's more wibbly wobbly, right? I get to be and color outside the lines, so I'm going to do that. I think your identity matters. Now, what I'd like you guys to do is please check in for part 2 of this. It'll probably be a day up after this one. But for now, I want to thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please like, comment, subscribe. Do remember that the comments are reviewed. So they come in and then they will be reviewed and seen if they're decent. That's just how we're doing it for now. At some point that may change. If you would like to support the channel, you can always donate at streamlabs.com/transgirltherapist/tip. You can also become a patron at patreon.com/transgirltherapist, right? So if you like the video, please like it and all that stuff, and we'll see you in the next one.